and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, the G20 summit concluded in Hangzhou yesterday, but we continue to take a look at the issues raised. In an exclusive interview, we speak with South Africa's President Jacob Zuma to find out how the only African country in the G20 group can contribute. And creating sustainable, inclusive growth. For the first time in G20 history, the group puts that on the summit agenda. But when it comes to global development, it's more than just economic. How will they achieve that goal? The 2016 G20 summit has concluded in Hangzhou, with leaders of major economies reaching a consensus on practical solutions for global growth and development. Chinese President Xi Jinping called on members to reform the structure of the global governance as the group seeks to boost the representation and inclusion of emerging market and developing countries. So how will that impact the continent of Africa, one of the focal points for discussion at this year's G20? In an exclusive interview with South African President Jacob Zuma, I asked him that question. South Africa is the only African country within the G20, as well as the BRICS group of emerging economies. Before we hear his answers, let's take a look at what the G20 had to say about developing economies.
Inclusive growth for all. This year, at the invitation of Chinese President Xi Jinping, a record number of developing countries attended the G20 summit in Hangzhou. Emerging economies contribute to more than 50% of global economic growth, but still lack a say. That's why President Xi called for a reform of the current structure of global governance in order to give developing countries more clout.
We
have made three firsts in regard to development issues. We have for the first time put development issues in a prominent position under the framework of global macroeconomic policies. We have for the first time made action plans for the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And we have for the first time decided to support together the industrialization of African and least developed countries. All these moves have significant meaning for the history of the G20.
The summit emphasized on sustainable development, especially in developing countries like those from the African continent. During the summit, President Xi said China supports Africa's positive contribution to global governance and world economic growth. China will continue to push the G20 members to help African countries realize industrialization and achieve its goals in poverty relief and sustainable development. And the only way to do so is by building capability, increasing investment, and improving infrastructure.
Well, it is good to know that the G20 economies have placed their attention on Africa. But the situation is more complicated than just what the communique spells out. And it is in the day-to-day operations of the African countries that we have to watch out for. In an exclusive interview with South African President Jacob Zuma, he indicated the complexity of development as he takes into the account, as he sees it, the continent's colonial past and its vulnerable economic structure. Let's listen in. During this year's G20 summit, Chinese president has made very clear at the very beginning that Africa will be one of the focal points. But it also depends on the other 19 economies of the G20, whether that will be the case and whether there will be concrete results.
Of course, President Xi Jinping made that point very clear, loud and clear, and nobody opposed that proposal. So everybody accepted that proposal, partly because they know the position of Africa, where Africa comes from. They also know the challenges of Africa. And therefore it is accepted that there must be a specific approach that is given to Africa.
And during this process, Mr. President, what should be Africa's role? Because you are the only African leader that is present there at the G20 economies. So what should be and could be and will be Africa's role?
Well, Africa, firstly, Africa has a particular history. Africa, I think, of all the regions of the world, was the only one which was totally colonized and stayed, therefore, for a long time without Africa doing its own things. When the countries from Europe were actually suppressing them for many years. I think it was only in the decade of the 60s that they began to get their independence. So whilst other countries were moving, they were, in a sense, trapped in the colonial situation. And they had to get a phase where they were fighting for their liberation. But also, the colonialists had come to occupy and dominate their resources, so to speak. So whatever Africa is trying to do now is coming up from a very heavy kind of suppression. And therefore, Africa is lagging behind. But Africa is saying it's a region that is emerging, that is now for the first time is trying to come together so that they have a collective kind of an approach as a region, and therefore it sees its future. And of course, South Africa, as one of the big economies in the continent, is a member of a G20. And South Africa does not represent itself only. It represents the continent, and therefore it speaks on behalf of the continent, whilst it is speaking also on its own behalf.
Infrastructure project usually takes a lot of cash. I understand there has been establishment of the BRICS New Development Bank. It has been running for 1 year. Even the South African has now become the vice head of that organization. And also the AIIB, which has just started with their first board meeting, global board meeting. What do you think, Mr. President? Will these two entities provide your country with more alternatives, even the African continent?
The continent had taken a very deliberate decision to establish infrastructure that is going to connect the entire continent. And heads of states are actually leading that kind of, there's a committee that is leading that kind of infrastructure to ensure that infrastructure is there. So, but also, the question of funding will always be a challenge. So the emergence of the BRICS Bank has been one of the most important kind of happening in our society, because BRICS Bank is different from other big banks that would have stringent conditions, wanted to do, and therefore Africa and South Africa, all of us, are looking at the BRICS Bank as the bank that is going to make things easier. And the BRICS itself has that understanding that Africa, that's why, whilst the headquarters of the bank are here in China and Shanghai, but a regional BRICS Bank is going to be in Africa, in South Africa.
It's an African center of the BRICS banks. But what is like to be the role of this African center?
It is actually, one of its main role will be to fund the infrastructure in Africa. That's what it's going to do. Already, there are projects that have been submitted to the bank here that now need to be looked at so that they can continue. So the emergence of the BRICS Bank has been a step forward for us.
President Zuma, industrialization of the African countries have been quite a debate, shall I say, over the past few years.
Yes.
But how? How to do industrialization? It has its positive connotations, sometimes it has its negative connotations. So what do you think is the approach that African countries, including yours, should adopt in order to have industrialization?
Well, there are many things that we need to do. The question of industrialization in our continent has one side only, does not have a negative
Really?
side.
Okay, tell us about it.
Why? Because we've never been industrialized in the past. Industrialization waves that have come and gone, Africa was not touched. And other countries industrialized. It's for the first time that we are industrializing. Because colonialists were not there to industrialize Africa. But in South Africa, you have a different kind of a situation wherein there was industrialization, but not by the indigenous people, the majority, by those who came to settle. Now what we are saying that the black people themselves must create the industry. So for the first time, we are creating middle class, we are creating people who are going to own businesses, for the first time. So it can't have a negative side, positive side all the time. We are going to create jobs. We are, for example, training our people, skilling them for the purposes of industrialization with us. So that's what we are looking at. Part of what President Jinping was saying, to focus on the continent, is actually to support, among others, industrialization itself.
Talking about industrialization, people look at China. Whether it's a China model or not, that's for debate. But certainly the China experience, what does that mean to you, Mr. President, and also other African nations?
What is critical with China is that the openness, much as they say so, but they are doing business as business, but guided by the Chinese characteristics. But what is important is that that in itself is a lesson to other people. How have the Chinese succeeded? It's because they've got discipline in the job they do. That's what people have got to adopt. I've said it to many people. You can wish to be Chinese, you'll never be, because you have got to have what guides them as the ideological approach, so to speak. But it's not say you cannot do it.
Known as Africa's most industrialized economy, South Africa regained the title of the continent's largest economy from Nigeria in August. Unlike Nigeria, which relies heavily on its oil exports, South Africa's economy is much more diverse. From a thriving manufacturing industry to a booming services sector, the country accounts for 24% of the continent's gross domestic product. Despite that, South Africa still faces the risk of recession, with its economy contracting in the first quarter of 2016. And politically, the country is moving to a new juncture. In its recent local elections, the ruling African National Congress had to share some of its power with opposition Democratic Alliance. That comes as a first since the end of apartheid in 1994. And some say this may reflect a change in South Africa's political landscape and future.
What do you make of these dramatic changes when it comes to the demands of qualities of political leadership?
Well, South Africa is a democratic country. It's just 20 years. The experience is very clear. Any former national liberation movement in 20 years, there are challenges politically that challenge the political party. What becomes important, how is that party responding to those challenges? That is important. I don't think the ANC is different from other former political parties. What is important is that the party must understand what is happening and it must say, what do we do to deal with this? For an example, 20 years in South Africa, it means democracy has matured and people generally are beginning to make the choices having thought in one form or the other, and it means, for an example, for the first time in South Africa, we've just gone through the local government elections, wherein people have made their choices, and we had 3 metros at the big waterfall that we were tying for the first time. And then there's been an introduction of a new element of coalitions, because there's no one party could rule without talking to small parties. So that's a new element that has come in, that even small parties can now determine which direction a metro goes or a municipality goes. That's a new kind of politics.
But what does that mean for the used to be major party?
It used to be a major party. It means we have reached a point where the democracy is now taking another kind of turn. The ANC then has to say, how do we handle this situation as a big party in the question of coalitions? We must now begin to plan and factor in the issue of coalitions when we go for elections. Because that's what it is all about. And this is the maturing of democracy. And that's what it is. If you look at old democracies, they don't have too many parties because they've been there for a while and parties have been sort of shrinking into either 2 or 3. So it's a process of democratic process that we are now 20 years, and therefore the politics, if you talk about winning elections are beginning to introduce a coalition factor, which has not been the factor before.
Mr. Nelson Mandela had been so respected around the world. I remember a few years ago when Mr. Mandela passed away, you were the one announcing the news to the rest of the world. What do you think it is the most important part of his legacy? And what would that mean for all politicians, including yourself, Mr. President, of your country?
President Mandela was made by the ANC to be greater. That is very important to know. It is the ANC that is much, much, much important to many of us, including President Mandela. He was part of shaping the policies of the ANC. And the ANC has not changed policy. So its leaders will always be there. But times are moving. And Mandela's legacy will always be remembered. Not just Mandela alone, Tambo, Oliver Tambo and others. And we are sticking to what Mandela practiced as a policy, believed in, and he believed in until he went, until he departed in this world. So we are the organization of Mandela. We are using the lessons from Mandela to run the organization, to run the country. So we think of Mandela as our leader who gave to us the lessons within the ANC framework, and we stick to them and will follow what Mandela did, and following that will never go wrong.
Mr. President, there are issues with your economy. For example, there are some estimates suggesting zero growth. So people are wondering, what kind of tools do you have in hand in order to change that situation, to put your economy on a better track?
Well, this is part of what we've been discussing as the G20, as to what do we do to boost up the economy, to, if we want, reignite the economy. What is that we can do? And I think the proposals coming from China through the president were very clear that we need to break and look at innovation as a critical driver of the economic growth, and you must have inclusive economic growth. There are many other kind of things that people are looking at. How do we do the situation? How do we create jobs? We need to agree, because right now, if we say the economy is sluggish, it means the investors are hesitant to invest. They're sort of holding their
Right.
money. And we are saying, let them be encouraged to do so. As a government in South Africa, we have in fact done a lot of job creation, trying to invest, trying to encourage the private sector. Now, if for an example, you are saying, let us grow the economy, and then you invest, or you protect your investment, we are using the term protectionist, but the workers who are working, they want higher wages. There is no sensitivity where we all should come together to say, since the economy is under challenge, what is it that we can sacrifice, all of us, in order to ensure that we can grow the economy?
One of the things that your economy is facing is the energy prices, the fluctuation of the energy prices. Of course, you try to seek ways out, but still at this moment difficult. What do you make of that dependence your economies have on the energy?
That is one of the difficulties. Perhaps our economy, one of the areas would be energy. The energy has a history as well, because everything in our country has its own history, because it was not worked on to take care of the entire population because of our history.
Right.
So we are almost like starting from anew, but we've been doing a lot of kind of progress from that point of view. And therefore, to us it is important, because energy is important for the economy to grow. And we are working hard to ensure we are, for an example, having a program of mixed energy, so that we do all types of energy, so that we can, in a sense, increase the volume of energy, so that that can help to generate the kind of economy that must go there. Of course, the price of energy, depending what we are talking about. For an example, other countries in Africa, they were affected with regard to the going down of fuel, or of oil rather, in other countries that are based themselves on the oil, and that caused a problem. We get more affected because we are the mining country, that the commodities coming from the mine also were no longer being attractive out there. So that in itself affected the kind of economy. And these are the matters we've got to say, how do we handle this situation as we go forward?
Mr. President, when you look at the African continent, what do you make of the role of South Africa? What do you think should be the role that South Africa plays on your continent, or representing your continent worldwide?
Well, South Africa is playing the role already. Firstly, in the African continent, we take it as a priority that we work with them. We are participating in shaping the approach that Africa makes. We are participating in addressing the problems of the continent. For an example, we are there to keep peace. We are there to influence that there should be peace. We are there to defend those who would be troubled by violence, etc. We use the capacity we have. We don't do this as one country. We do this as part of a collective of the AU. And there we play a part. We play a part outside of the continent by sensitizing the world about the challenges of the continent. Right now, South Africa is the member of the G20. It's not raising its own matters only. It raises the matters of the continent. That's part of the role it is playing. When BRICS came for the first time to meet in South Africa asked the leaders of the continent, particularly those who have specific responsibilities, to meet with BRICS, to raise the issues with BRICS, and it was a very useful kind of meeting. That act has introduced in BRICS leaders what is now called the outreach. That when BRICS meets, leaders in the region would also come, which means that's how South Africa sees its role, and it is acting on its role.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your trust and your confidence, Mr. President.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is South African President Jacob Zuma talking to CCTV exclusively right after the G20 summit wrap-up in Hangzhou on Monday evening. And on Tuesday, the latest economic data suggested South Africa's economy avoided a second recession in 7 years as mining and factory output rebounded. But when things apparently get better, it is even more important to focus on the real issue, namely how to build a sustainable economic model, implement structural reform, and win the hearts and minds of the people. Stay with us here on World Insight. Coming up in our final segment. Creating sustainable, inclusive growth. How will the G20 economies achieve that with developing countries? And how does healthcare and poverty play into global prosperity? Stay tuned as we discuss this. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. When it comes to global development, we're not just talking about economic growth. There are also qualitative indicators such as healthcare, mortality, and poverty to look out for. The recently concluded G20 summit in Hangzhou was a platform for world leaders and international organizations to discuss the future and to focus on the long-term goals of global prosperity.
What kind of world do we want for our children? That question is the reason why global heads need to gather to blueprint the future.
Summit members have approved the G20 Summit Hangzhou communique. This further clarifies the direction, targets, and measures for further development of the G20. A long-term, comprehensive, open, innovative, and inclusive Hangzhou Consensus for Development has come into being.
Inclusive growth and the development of less developed countries were emphasized. Its aim? Achieving less inequality. A more detailed plan exists. Last year, the United Nations spearheaded the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, an intergovernmental set of aspiration goals. China is among those countries which are working towards that. With success and experience in poverty reduction, the UN believes the biggest developing country and the second largest economy can contribute in many ways.
And I have already been very much impressed by such economic and social development where people really live in peace and stability. And that's quite encouraging. But this kind of benefit and opportunity should be shared. Should be shared by all the people around the world.
On Monday, China's First Lady Peng Liyuan, together with the spouses of leaders attending the G20 summit, went on an anti-AIDS advocacy tour. She also called for a redoubling of international efforts against the disease. She is a World Health Organization Goodwill Ambassador for tuberculosis and HIV. Her calls are echoed by the international organizations gathered in Hangzhou, seeing problems from poverty to a lack of health care. The G20 group is trying to find answers and drive real change. And perhaps it will be these changes that will lead us to a more sustainable and inclusive future.
And here in our Beijing studio, we are joined by Mr. Mark Zussman, who is the Chief Executive Officer and President of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Mark, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
The reason why you're here is because you have been focusing on the issue of development for a long time, and that is really the focus of conclusion for this year's G20 summit. What do you make of it that eventually development is there as one of the major themes?
Well, we're very excited to see how prominent development is in the final Hangzhou summit communique, because we think it is of central importance to really having the kind of inclusive growth that the G20 made such a priority in the discussions over the last few days.
And I remember at the very beginning, it was several years ago, also during the G20 summit, that development issue was being raised, but not necessarily being focused on. Help us to understand that part of history.
Yes, that's correct. So a few years ago, when the French were hosting the G20 summit, then President Sarkozy invited Bill Gates to come and present a report to the G20 leaders about development and the role that the G20 could play, and focus on that. And while the report was very well received, there actually hadn't been an enormous amount of follow-up in recent years. Distraction because of other global crises, whatever the reasons. But I think that kind of loss of focus means that development got taken off the agenda, and now with President Xi's leadership and Chinese leadership and the current presidency, it's great to see it being put firmly back on as a top priority.
Of course, Mr. Gates this time was not being invited to the G20 because it was a summit of the state leaders. However, he did send certain messages earlier before the G20 summit and talk about the development issue, especially the recognition towards China's efforts in boosting development and eliminating poverty. Let's take a look at this.
The G20 is a vital international forum where leaders of the world's major economies work together to strengthen global economic security and increase prosperity. For the first time, the issue of development has been given priority in the global policy framework, and that global health has been included in the G20 development agenda. It's also great to see the strong commitment of the Hangzhou summit to formulate an action plan to implement the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. China's experience and achievements and its focus on leveraging innovation to drive positive change offer valuable insights for other developing countries as they tackle similar challenges and strive to meet the ambitious targets of the Sustainable Development Goals.
That, of course, is Mr. Bill Gates talking about the theme of this year's G20 summit. He talked one thing that's very interesting, which is China experience. There's so many different interpretations, Mark, about what exactly those are. What do you think exactly is China's experience?
Well, for us and for the foundation overall, as we partner with China, there are two key elements. One is a clear, direct focus on alleviation of poverty and really helping bring up, which China has succeeded in doing, literally hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty.
What is the secret remedy that China had for that?
I don't think it's a secret remedy, and China doesn't try to make it a secret. It's a remedy about a government paying attention to the needs of the poorest, investing in health, which is a very important area, investing in areas like agricultural development, which is where a lot of the poorest live in rural areas, and you generate dynamic economic growth and opportunities for them, and investing in other opportunities like education, the needs of women and girls. And China has done all of these things successfully and is sharing those lessons and now developing new innovations in areas like vaccines, in areas like new agricultural products, that we've been very happy to work with China to see if we can spread to other developing countries.
Talking about some of the things you mentioned, for example, eliminate poverty in China, that was the efforts made over decades since the reform and opening up. Over the past 30 years, it has been a very gradual process. But now, as you may know, Mark, that we have already come into another critical juncture. That is not only just eliminate poverty, but how to push forward another round of reform and to move the country even further. So once again, people are looking back at that period of time, Mark, and say, what did we do? How did we do it? And how could we have the courage and the confidence and the urgency to do it, and do it in the right way? So from that perspective, Mark, how would you reflect upon it?
Well, reflect on it in two ways. First, really, it was a commitment that involved the people and the government working together with the private sector, with other partners in a dynamic way and against a shared set of measurable goals and objectives. And you were able to track year by year. You say the progress was gradual, but in other ways it was very rapid. It was the fastest reduction in poverty that the world has ever seen. And the second is staying really focused, even as you get wealthier and you get a new middle class, you still stay focused on the needs of the poor. So China right now is grappling with the fact that there are still over 50 million people living in extreme poverty in China, and the government and President Xi Jinping have made a priority of eliminating that lost gap by 2020, even while trying to also continue to generate the dynamism of a modern economy, so you provide more opportunities for those who've already been lifted out of poverty.
Right.
And it's that balance and focus that is so critical. It's difficult, but I think that's the vision that underlies the new G20 declaration, and that other countries in the G20 need to do for themselves and in support of other developing countries.
Particularly at a time when every economy is running into challenges of their own version. But some would say, is the China experience really quote-unquote copyable in a way? Because China's circumstances, political circumstances, specific historical period of time, very different from all the other countries. Everybody has their own issues. Is it really that easy to learn China examples or China experiences?
Well, when you talk about the China experience as a single experience, no, of course it's a unique experience. What there are elements around that that are absolutely possible to copy. The focus on direct health care and health provision for the poor.
But government plays a big role
Absolutely.
in there.
Government
Should
is
the
a
government
critical
play
role.
that big role? In China, there's even debate between government and the market, you know?
When the government plays a role, when you're talking about the needs of the poorest, government has to play a role, either as a direct provider or as an enabler of the market to allow the private sector to come in and provide the products and the services, and to provide appropriate regulation and safety and other tools to make sure that the right medicines are getting to the people who need it, that the right type of education is getting to the children who need it. So it is that balance. And yes, absolutely, I think that while every country has to map out its own path to development and prosperity, that you can take the elements of the model and different focuses in health, in education, in infrastructure development, and job creation, and apply those in multiple other situations.
Right. Mark, this time, inclusive growth, one of the very important focal points. And many believe this is really the time to do it, because you see people are upset and angry about the establishment. People are upset about the wealth gap. But then how to do it? Let me give you an example. The role of women, the role of the youth. How can you incorporate them into the already existing slow-paced governance system? That is the big question mark.
Absolutely. So first you have to measure and know what you're doing. So in the role of women in particular, the new United Nations Sustainable Development Goal Agenda 2030, which was cited in the G20 communique, has a dedicated goal, Goal 5, which is about the role of women. It's about understanding women access to assets, to income, to legal protections, but we don't have a lot of data around how to do that. So that's why, for example, Melinda Gates early this year made a $60 million commitment into new data provision to check, are women getting the same access to cell phones, to bank accounts, to agricultural extension, to education?
We can't just wishful thinking. We need to know
absolutely.
exactly
You need to know,
what the realities
you need to measure,
are.
and then you need to act on it.
Yes, indeed. But what about the young people? Rise of anti-globalization, populism. Young people sometimes play a big role in it. The reason for that is because they feel disillusioned about their realities and even more about their future.
Absolutely. So the way to address that is really to give young people hope and a belief that there really are opportunities. What we see now is a reaction, a belief that the deck is stacked against them, especially in many rich countries, that there are no opportunities left, that there are not going to be jobs, that they aren't going to enjoy lives as good as their parents. What we need to do is reset that expectation and say, not only will you enjoy lives as good, we can have a better world for everybody if we focus on inclusion. And that means providing opportunities for the very poorest at the bottom of the scale and provides new opportunities for those who already reached a certain level of income and are looking for the next level.
But you know, Mark, this is not necessarily going to happen overnight. So people have to wait for a certain period of time before they see prosperity, again, that obvious. Is that going to be possible, politically speaking? How do you, coming from the civil society, work with governments, business people, and also other elements of the societies together to make that happen?
Well, Bill and Melinda Gates like to call themselves impatient optimists. And in this, we remain very, very optimistic that there are opportunities and that there are solutions.
What are those opportunities? What are those solutions? You have to be specific.
Absolutely.
Here.
So what we have to do is demonstrate. So for example, in the area of agricultural development, which is one we work on extensively in Africa and other parts of Asia, what you can do is you can provide more productive crops, training, access to markets, new opportunities for jobs and employment. That in turn generates positive economic growth. It provides knock-on opportunities for new industries, for food processing. It provides knock-on opportunities for exports. That's one very specific area where there are particular comparative advantages, and you can look at that in many, many other sectors, in services, in healthcare directly. And so what a role of an organization like ours can do is we can put our resources to use to create and invest in concrete examples in agriculture and health and demonstrate those for governments and the private sector and say, this is what your investments can produce.
And of course, you're not alone. There are many other international organizations, Chinese domestic organizations, different national ones that are doing their work, particularly, for example, about healthcare. The Chinese First Lady, Madam Peng Liyuan, she herself is extremely committed about the healthcare issue. She, during this year's G20 summit, even was leading a whole delegation of First Ladies and spouses to Zhejiang University and once again work on campaigns about AIDS children. But even with that kind of support, how long do we need to expect things to change before it gets worse?
Well, I look at it in the other direction again. Take that specific example. Madam Peng has been an extraordinary leader and advocate in HIV prevention in this country. And really, if you take the counterfactual, if there hadn't been the kind of effort that made that we were proud to help support around prevention in HIV/AIDS 7, 8, 9 years ago, and that has been built in, today we would see a much greater AIDS crisis, not just here in China, but around the world. And so that's just one example where instead of having a crisis, you have a range of opportunities for younger people who have been affected by HIV/AIDS. And if you translate that into other areas and other diseases, in tuberculosis, in malaria, in other infectious diseases that typically affect the poor, there are actually real opportunities. The last 10, 15 years have seen more progress than the world has ever seen, and we're confident the next 15 years can see the same.
The conclusion of the G20 summit this time, we see an interesting coincidence that the conclusion it had has a lot to do with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, has a lot to do with many of those important causes that many have been working on for years. What do you make of this change, that it's really moving from just the economy to development, to sustainable growth, to many of the issues concerning our society, Mark?
I think it's a recognition, and the Sustainable Development Goals themselves are a recognition that while economic growth is central, it is not enough for a healthy and productive life for all human beings, which is what we aspire to support at the Gates Foundation. You need those other building blocks. You need a clean environment. You need educational opportunities. You need health.
All right. Mark, thank you so much for sharing with us what you think and your reflections about the G20 summit. I hope development is not just a word, but rather implementation over the years. Thank you, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insights CCTV News into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone from the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time, tomorrow, for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.